Welcome everybody to the show. Today, we're going to find out how we're going to burn the house down with the Stone Cold Steve Austin Broken Skull sessions. Let's do it. Welcome everybody to Tap Out Talk. I am your host, Bryan, and here we are going to go over another episode of the much famed Steve Austin, the Broken Skull Sessions. And today we're going to cover episode 3, The Big Red Machine Kane, also known as Glenn Jacobs. We're going to cover all the highlights and the delights. Remember how this works. This is the podcast of the podcast. So if you don't want to watch an hour and a half of the full content on the WWE Network, that's perfectly fine because you can come here and get, like I said, the highlights and the delights. Let's go ahead and let's cover the material. Well, we start off with our opening as usual. Austin welcomes Glenn Jacobs to the Broken Skull Sessions, also known as Kane, the Big Red Machine from the WWE performing world, for being one of the baddest men he's ever wrestled. Also, one of the nicest guys on the planet. And as I go ahead and continue on here with our podcast, I'm going to refer to him just as Kane. There's a lot during this podcast where Austin will bounce back and forth between his name and then also Kane. So we're just going to go with Kane from here on out. So they immediately start talking politics. And just as they're doing that, they open the podcast and they really plug Mayor Kane, which is Kane's new autobiography that Austin says the book teaches life lessons about living the American dream. Kane says the American dream is being able to make a life for yourself and talks about how he played football and injured his knee. And he thought he had a mindset for pro wrestling. And it gave him a life in which he could only dream of. So it prefaces a little bit about the book. I have heard from other people that have read this book that it was a good, fun read. You get a little bit of wrestling and you get a little bit of politics. And it is amazing that, Glenn Jacobs, a.k.a. Kane here, was able to, be Kane and also have a post wrestling life and actually have his hands in quite a bit of things other than movies. So I do think that was pretty impressive, and I, will probably be reading this myself, but just as Austin says in the podcast, enough with the plugging of the book. Let's get into a little bit of the history of Kane. So we start off, they talk about Kane getting into wrestling overall, and they talk about how Kane was living in St. Louis, being a pro wrestling fan growing up, and it was a hotbed for wrestling in the territory days. He would watch all the local stuff, and when his family got cable, he was able to watch the NWA and the WWF. Kane then kind of jumps to Austin, then jumps into Kane about blowing out his knee and deciding to get into wrestling. Kane talks about his first major show he ever saw was in the WWF Checker Dome. It was when Hulk Hogan was at his peak, and his entrance blew the roof off the place. And he had never seen anything like that and knew that it was what he wanted to do since the day he was born. And, I think that kind of ties into a lot of us as fans. We watch it as kids and we get hooked. And then a lot of these guys are fans at heart that go on to live their dream. So he found a local group to train him. And it was in this ring that was actually in a hayloft in a barn. He trained for a few months and then went to Nashville where he learned quite a bit from Jerry Jarrett in the USWA. As he kind of went there, he started out in the industry. You can see here he was known as the Christmas Creature, right? It is just kind of a rough gimmick. His arms were wrapped like candy canes and tights, and then he had tinsel wrapped all over his body and garland, and you do what you got to do to get under the hood and get in the business, right? And thank God nobody recognizes you until we have sessions like this. As he went over the ASWA, he had quite a few, USWA, he had quite a few matches and, back and forth, but he was a big man, but he was very green, right? And, when he talks about getting into wrestling, he talks about the Malenkos giving him a lot of credit, and he credits them for building him back up and putting him in front of the fans and learning the psychology of the ring. So, you might remember some of them as Dean Malenko from the WCW days, but the Malenkos really taught Kane how to, work the industry, and they had to kind of unlearn some of those bad habits that were taught, when he was, so to speak, born in a barn, right? So from there, they actually jump into what was known as the WWC in Puerto Rico, and we get some footage of Kane working down there, which is pretty sweet on the podcast. And Kane talks about Dutch Mantel being the champion and having a stable of heels called La Familia. And so, Dutch Mantel, one of the, you might know him as Zeb Coulter in the WWE days, but, We the People. But he was a very good manager on the indie scene, and, he got a little bit of time to shine in WWE. So he talks about a story of how Mantel split his head above his eye, falling on a corner of a bleacher. And the heat for the whole segment was so crazy that a SWAT team actually had to be shown up, and Kane calls it a really hairy night. So Austin says that, this is what you call money drawing heat. And then from there, Kane went on to become known as Unabomb. Okay, so that was like his, next big man gimmick was Unabomb. And Kane says that Cornette just kind of thought the name was kind of cool. And so they talked about Taker, who came over to Cornette's territory and was facing the Unabomb or Unabomber in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. And of course, we have footage of that as well that gets shown on the podcast. Taker wins with the tombstone to pop the crowd, so this was just Taker really just a really good match, and Austin agrees. And then he calls, and he says, Kane says that even back then the Taker was always really good to him, and they always got along really well. So I think this was like the prequel, Unabomber versus The Undertaker in kind of a house show in Smoky Mountain. And I think this was a way for WWE to scout some big talent because they knew they had something planned. Well, little did we know that plan was going to eventually lead to meeting Vince McMahon. And it seems like on these Austin podcasts, we always get a little session of what it's like to meet Vince McMahon. And you guys have heard the stories before, right? There's always a big deal to meet Vince, but it's always just kind of an odd interaction. And Vince has this way of coming up with characters that some guys can make work and some guys can't. And some are good and some are not. Kane finally gets a phone call from the WWE. And he is then given Dr. Isaac Yankem, DDS. And Kane says that the meeting actually was with Vince and J.J. Dillon, who was still head of talent relations at the time. And, the idea that they wanted to go with was Isaac Yankem, a dentist with rotten teeth. And you guys may remember, they actually brought him in. Vince basically loved the idea, right? Vince told him he always had a great idea for a wrestling dentist, and he was happy to get the call. But at the same time, he was very uneasy about doing this. He asked Cornette, and Jim told him that they, being the WWF, would figure it out. And he says the gimmick took a ton of wind out of his sails. Kane actually says that he had heard that the idea was originally Bobby Heenan's, and Vince wanted to do it for a long time. And Austin says he remembers watching it, and he actually just hated the gimmick, right? You guys might remember Dr. Isaac Yankem was actually brought in during a Bret Hart, Jerry Lawler feud, right? And then the idea was they led to a King of the Ring, a Kiss My Foot match in which Jerry Lawler was training in his horse stables barefooted, walking around in horse manure. And then the idea is he would make Bret Hart kiss his horse foot or his horse manured foot. And so then what happened was in that match, of course, Bret Hart won. And he made the King actually kiss his own foot and shoved his foot in his mouth. Well, then the story goes on and the tale goes that Jerry Lawler could not get that taste out of his mouth and he had to go to his dentist. And then that Jerry Lawler's dentist was Isaac Yankem, DDS. And he was so mad that he wanted to get revenge on Bret Hart. And then leads in Glenn Jacobs' first gimmick here in the WWF. So, I bet that was a little bit trying, and I remember seeing him, and I was thinking that he had rotted teeth, and it was like, oh boy. But you definitely see he had some potential, but you couldn't get past the gimmick, right? Before we get to the next gimmick, though, they jump to the Kuwait trip, and this is where Vader got in trouble for grabbing a talk show host who asked him if wrestling was fake. And Kane says that Leon was working with Taker, Leon being Vader, and when he got in trouble, they needed someone else to work with him. So they brought up using Glenn under a hood, and Vince liked the idea, but he felt like they could tell a longer story, not just blow it off on a one night only. So they kind of talked a little bit about that and how he kind of got a little chance to work under a hood against Taker, when Vader got in trouble and eventually, kicked out of WWE for good. Which then we get into a little bit of his next chance, because as the Isaac Yankem wasn't working too well and they just didn't know what to do with him, they jumped to the fake Diesel, gimmick. And Austin says, it was what it was, but Kane says it was another step in the right direction. He was committed to the role, and he said it did help his get his confidence back. But he says, and it kept him in the game as it showed Vince that he would work hard and try. They laugh, and then together they laugh that if a guy was willing to be Isaac Yankem and then a fake Diesel, he's probably a keeper. So they talk about how some guys come in with great characters and they're given a rocket push to the moon, but they don't work really hard and aren't professionals, and they're gone in months, right? And in this case, Glenn Jacobs, Kane, who would become Kane, survive these terrible gimmicks. And sometimes when you're just willing to, kind of work through those tough conditions, it shows you're the legit guy. And so I remember this angle actually myself, and I remember I was you had Kevin Nash, which was Diesel, and then Scott Hall, which was Razor Ramon, left WWE for WCW, and then they advertised the next week on Raw that Diesel and Razor Ramon would still be on Raw, and then the fans got a little nice swerve where it was a fake Diesel and a fake Razor Ramon, since they owned the rights to those characters, and it really was terrible. They just didn't, they didn't pull it off well, but it did hook me to watch for 1 week, and then I kind of felt very taken. So let's go ahead, and we're going to get into, his most successful character. And we're going to talk about the origins of the Big Red Machine Kane. This is where, Kane really accrued, and his character, this is where it really took off. Austin wants to talk about the origin of Kane, and it was Bruce and Cornette who pitched the idea to him, and it played out over several months. Kane went to New York for a TV taping, and he thought he was going to be like a Michael Myers, but he was shown drawings of what it looks like, kind of like a superhero, which, they kind of show on the podcast at this point. And then all the stuff is, looks pretty awesome. But, and I think the biggest thing was that you had the Kane attire, and Kane originally had a cape, that he wore. And so I think that's kind of what gave him the superhero look. And he was kind of thinking, oh no, this is going to be a bad gimmick again, right? And then he's told that if he wants, to pitch something else to Vince, he can call Vince. He pitches his idea for the character, but Vince tells him they have done things like that in the past. And the idea is that Kane is dressing like a superhero to overcome his inadequacies. And in Vince's mind, Kane was a cool character and not an evil one. It was JR, good old Jim Ross, who came up with the idea for a one eye to be different, and it got it from actually from Marilyn Manson, who was a popular rocker in those days, right? Who had both eyes done like that. So Austin then, when you kind of talk about the eyes and the mask, Austin goes into not just the eyes, but the mask, and says they had a hard time finding people to make them. The wardrobe department had to get them made from an S&M place until they could make their own. Kane says the problem with the mask was that it was leather, and it would lose its shape quite a bit. So he then says the mask would last about 4 to 5 months, and sometimes they would have, just one for TV. And then Kane says he would spend 30 minutes after the match just trying to get the tangles out of his hair. So that was his long hair back then, before he had to start shaving, his head, in which the hair was just kind of built into the mask at that point. Austin wanted to know how it was working behind the mask, since, Austin never had to do anything like that. And Kane says he over-exaggerated his facials a lot and learned body language. he definitely used body language to his advantage. He learned the head tilt from actually from his Saint Bernard growing up. It was just kind of a understanding, a beast understanding type thing. And that's awesome. Bruce told him that he got more out of that head tilt in 20 minutes than a 20-minute promo that could have occurred. So that was definitely a way of Kane kind of coming about himself in the mask with the character and really building it up. Austin then talks about working with the character, and when he was stunning Steve, that was just a name that he was trying to be, basically Ric Flair, right? When he became Stone Cold, that was a different character that he had to become that character. So Kane says the same happened to him and says that he had a template to work with from as he had to, mimic The Undertaker somewhat since he was going to be his brother. And soon he did things that became natural to him and realized that it was him getting into the Kane character. So, and then that kind of leads us into, some of the origins that happened. And we finally debuted Kane after all this planning. We talk about the debut, and they go into what happened at WWE In Your House Bad Blood, right? And this was the site in St. Louis, and it was the first ever Hell in the Cell match in the entire WWE, where it was Shawn Michaels versus The Undertaker for the title, and it was a WWE classic. And he tells the story when he heard before on an Untold episode where he nearly missed the show because his friend's car broke down on the way to the show, and we now get footage from the debut of Kane, and it says the first time he heard the music was when it played right before he debuted. So this was one of his favorite versions of the character, and he puts over Earl Ebner for taking a great bump as the referee, but also puts over Taker's facial recognitions, helping the character get over as well. Austin then talks about the quiet from the crowd, and that is a great quiet, as it's because the crowd was in shock instead of being bored. So that's the best kind of quiet you can get. They were in awe, and they wanted to see what was going on. So they talk a little bit about the communication that he had with Taker, and Taker was always on and with him more aggressive, and then he went back to where he was Isaac Yankem again. And it was back then when he realized he had a conversation with him that made him realize he was there for a reason. They really wanted someone to work with Mark. They wanted somebody to work with The Undertaker. And Kane talks about how Kane setting off the pyro by lowering his arms was the Taker's idea, and that he was supposed to do everything opposite of the Taker. So, the idea is you had these two brothers of destruction, so to speak, right? Undertaker and Kane. And you had this great backstory with their manager, Paul Bear. And Kane debuted, ripped off the cage, and Undertaker refused to fight his brother, but his brother wanted revenge. And then with Kane, being able to control fire with his arms, that led into a legend and an iconic series of matches between these two brothers. And those matches were the Inferno match. That was one of the biggest matches and the first time ever in the WWE. Austin brings up the Inferno match, and they start discussing that. The Inferno match, he asks if anything got hairy. Kane says that it was safe as can be, and they were supposed to rehearse it the night before. They had a limo that was to take them to Fayetteville, but the limo driver drove 2 hours in the wrong way. It was for a house show, and Kane was advertised, so he got there and did 30 seconds with Vader, then back in the limo for the Inferno match rehearsal. The rehearsal didn't happen since they canceled it, and then both men, with the stunt people who were kind of amazed that they were doing it in real time, did a burn test on Kane's arm. Kane said that the match was visually spectacular, but they couldn't do any kind of false finishes because it was too hot near the flames. So Kane says he did, burn himself on the finish as he was selling the arm that caught fire and accidentally swung the other arm back and hit apparatus, basically. He hit that, and then what was basically touching a hot stove. And so we have a video of that was shown as well. And, that had to suck because definitely you're playing with fire, you're going to get burned, right? So, but their match, they definitely, I remember that match. They got actually fire surrounding the ropes in the ring, right? And so, and the idea is the first person to set your opponent on fire, is the one that's going to win this match, right? So, and that's exactly what happened. As Kane's arm got caught on fire, and the Undertaker won. From here, they jump back a little bit to WrestleMania 14, and where we had Undertaker versus Kane for the first encounter. And Austin mentions that in the same night he won the WWF title, where he wasn't sure if Shawn was going to make it to the ring. Kane talks about marking out over the Taker's Druid entrance and with the torches, and Paul Bearer told him to calm down as he was going to, have a heart attack. So Austin, calls it fantastic match, and then they basically knocked it out of the park in his opinion. Austin then relates the story to where he had all of everything that he had planned to do with the Taker. When he made his entrance with all the smoke, he was so caught up that he forgot everything. Kane says it is intimidating and says it's most thought that the match at Mania was the last of Kane. And he talks about kicking out of two tombstone pile drivers and at the same time. And then when Hogan was only able to do it once. So he says he lost the match, but Taker made him by letting him kick out of the finisher twice and letting him lay him down after the match. So Kane definitely talks about his relationship with Mark Calloway, the Undertaker, and how he always, saw something in him. He was the guy that pushed everything and is the reason that Kane lasted so long. He gave him so many chances to really just want to work with him, even from the pre-WWE days. So there were some times when he doubted if he wanted to do wrestling, but he went to Taker for advice, and he talked about how much, it meant to see Taker come out to help, especially when he was on the campaign trail. He was told by Vince before that Mark worries more about Kane than Kane does himself, which, that just goes to really show the relationship between these two guys and a true friendship. So they've done a lot of business together. Speaking about business and business picking up, after Austin won the title at King Ring, we did get some more unique Kane type matches, and we got a first blood match. So Austin then wants to go there, and now we talk about the Kane-Austin feud from Austin, Texas, and on Raw, where Austin had blood dropped on him. Austin calls it one of his favorite angles he ever shot. Kane talks about how their angle had threads with Taker and Foley all intertwined in this whole angle. And Austin was wearing a white t-shirt, which showed off the blood even better. And then at that point, that leads to the first blood match at Hell in a Cell in Pittsburgh. Before we get there, though, Austin brings up the fact that the show in Houston, Texas, and his parents were there to see him. He asked Kane if his parents ever attended a show, and Kane says, well, his mom took a sign that read, "I raised Kane." They get a good laugh out of that. And then after the show in Houston, Austin started shaking and was taken to the hospital, where he stayed for 3 days with a staph infection in his elbow. He told them that he needed to leave as he had a match with Kane coming up. So they had that going against them. Plus they had to follow the Taker Mankind Hell in a Cell match. Austin brings up, having to follow that match. And Kane, definitely says that he still got hot at Mick. He won his first world title that night, and nobody remembers. If you remember, Kane did win the title that evening. But yeah, nobody remembers because of the Mick Foley Undertaker match and the Hell in a Cell. That was the most iconic, right? So breaking off the roof, he brings up the fact that Mick was part of the finish. And as their match was happening, Vince told Kane if Mick couldn't go, that he would need to come up with a finish. And so Kane was stunned that he had no idea what to do. And so he says that, the most relieved person when he saw Mick coming down the aisle was him. Austin says that, they worked their asses off in that match. And as it was a brawl, they showed footage from the match, and Kane and Austin talked it over. We get Mick doing his limp in, and then Austin could only think that Mick was coming through as one of the toughest guys in the business. Taker limps down as well, and here we had we heard he had a broken ankle. Kane mentions it happened when they were at Raw doing a pre-tape with Taker chasing Paul Bearer, and it broke when he kicked a TV. So the finish sees Taker blasting Austin in the head with a chair, splitting him wide open, and bam, that's it. And Kane is the new WWF champion. And Austin says he isn't a mark for belts, but being the world champion is being the world champion. And Kane remembers back at the hotel room when he had twin beds. He gave the belt one of the beds for the night. And the next night they were in Cleveland and they run a rematch. And because of Austin's beef with the Taker, caused him to bleed and not Kane. So they talk a little more about how Kane wanted to prove, that he was better than the Undertaker. And the only reason that, he had the belt was because of the Taker. So he needed to show that, he could beat Austin. And again, he had to get his point across without saying a word. So, that made it a little tough for his character, right? Which, Paul Bearer was able to help him with. So at this point, then we get footage from the match of Austin, and he tells the Taker and everyone that says yes. And it does when he basically, gets hit with steps. Paul Bearer hits Austin with a shoe, and Austin laughs and how heavy he is, and when guys try to, get him up for moves. Austin hits the stunner, and the crowd reactions is crazy. And as he wins back the WWF title, Austin says he didn't have a ton of energy, and as he was still getting over being in the hospital. Kane says that losing the title to Austin was a bigger deal to him than winning the title. He mentions that they booked themselves into a corner here at this point. Everyone figured Austin was winning at King of the Ring. Well, they all figured out how Kane was and going to get out of setting himself on fire, and then the rematch and had crazy energy as well, and all the fans wanted to see. And so Austin, did win his title back, but Kane mentions that that was also the start of the Brothers of Destruction, where Kane and the Undertaker joined forces for once. So that's kind of where we get into a little bit with the First Blood. And so then the Brothers of Destruction started seeing Kane and the Undertaker as allies at this point, which then led on to Kane kind of, having some tag team, matches for a little bit of the era in the Attitude Era. So Austin laughs about them being booked as heels, but the visual of the two monsters destroying people made them cool. Kane talks about how Taker and his character had mythology about them, and the people always wanted to see them fight and figured it would always happen. They discussed tag wrestling then at this point, and Austin says that he liked tagging with Triple H, but he's a singles guy, and Kane says he gives the same answer Malenko did. It depends on your partner. He likes the different dynamic in tag wrestling, but mentions he hates triple threat matches and such, but loves tag team wrestling. So Austin hates that you're so dependent on someone else, and if something happens to them, you're kind of stuck in the middle there. So Austin brings up that he was managed by Percy Pringle, which was the late great Paul Bearer. And Kane says that Paul was his manager, and when he didn't have to be, all Paul wanted Kane to focus on was the matches. So he would take care of the plane tickets, the hotels, etc. And the only time that really was in San Diego with a red Cadillac. Kane would wear a ski mask so fans wouldn't recognize him. And on this loop, Paul got them a red Cadillac. And as they were pulling into the arena, Paul rolls down the window and screams, "It's a miracle. Kane can drive. Kane can drive." And the fans swarmed the car. It was pretty awesome. So, with him in the mask, and he always had to wear that mask to portray the character. And then after so many years and so much success in this business, you got to always reinvent yourself. And this is where Kane found a way to reinvent himself by getting rid of his beloved mask. And the way they did that, as you can see, there was the mask reveal, and the idea was he was supposed to be burned with underneath his mask. So WWE had to kind of figure a way to get him to get rid of the mask without, getting rid of the storyline. So back to the discussion of the mask and the decision to get rid of it. Kane thought he had gone as far as he could with the mask, and he wanted to reinvent himself. So that was his idea. He also wanted the chance to show off his face and show a new layer to himself. Vince was behind the whole idea, while others didn't want to fix what wasn't broken. But he was willing to take the risk, and it happened at MSG footage from the show where Kane shows his face and then chokeslams RVD. Kane mentions he did feel naked and really weird without the mask. Austin talks about seeing the rage and the pain in Kane's face, which he'd been practicing under the mask for all those years. And when the mask was gone, he felt it made Kane look scarier when he lost the mask. So Kane agrees and says that, losing the mask showed who Kane really could be and took away the superhero look that he had going on. The only thing that made him nervous was losing all of his hair, or losing all of his long hair. And that really was because they were supposed to shave him bald, but Bruce told them to stop halfway through and got Vince. They loved the look of the half-shaved head, and after just a day, Kane told them he had to shave the whole thing, and they agreed. So they did this half-shaved head thing, and I think they were trying to go for like he was burned and scarred, so his hair didn't grow all the way. Austin, then says that he had a kind of a bone to pick with them. So one of the things that he kind of, chatted about was his good old buddy JR, and he talks about when Kane actually got into JR's face and set JR on fire, right? We get a segment where Austin asks Kane how it felt, and he asks him, the chance to let loose with the character. He said he was able to delve into the mind of the character, and he says he could focus on the character. And the Red Dragon from Hannibal Lecter's series thing was Kane never had any scars, but he wore the mask because he mentally thought he did. And I thought that was always a cool storyline. Like, he thought mentally he was burned, so he wore a mask to make sure that nobody could see his scars, but they were only the ones that he could see. So yeah, and then that preceded him to, kind of get into JR and light JR on fire and give him some scars. So they discussed the promos, and Kane says it was good internalization, and that they had to do some JR segments a few times, and it was written out for him. And JR was wasn't happy about the situation, and they had a great photo of JR flipping off whoever had the camera. Kane says that there was a can of gasoline there, and it's just the WWE, so you had to do something was going to be happening there. So, and at that point, that's kind of when Kane just went on a rampage again and kind of reinvented himself as the monster. And then we get to a point in his career that they want to talk about next, where he had to reinvent himself and be a little more comedic. And that started with Team Hell No. So this all began as a classic, image of Taker, Shawn Michaels, and Triple H sharing a group hug at the top of WrestleMania of the stage. It wasn't pre-planned, according to the Taker. And when it happened organically, there was a genuine tear running down his face. And, that made Kane think about, different moments that he should have. And Team Hell No definitely, was some great, material where him and Daniel Bryan were also having their own kind of, back and forth and relationships, and they went to the therapy sessions. And so they talk a little bit about that and how they were in therapy to, for Kane, and he had to talk about his past angles. And then, so that brought out a new tag team with Daniel Bryan, which was very successful, and the crowd just loved. So, and then from there, we got a little more comedy Kane. And comedy Kane, consisted of quite a bit of things. So Austin brings up the famous video of Kane cutting a promo backstage on The Rock and Hogan as he imitates both of them. It was classic. The crowd reaction and the Kane posing was amazing. Kane says he loved that, and the people still bring it up to him all the time. He knows every person has done the Hulk Hogan imitation, and Austin mentions he has done it. So Kane says that he was standing next to The Rock and Hogan, and yet, he hasn't gotten to be the star yet. So we stay with the comedy, and we focus on Pete Rose, just kind of going after that, and he had quite a bit of a career with Pete, chasing down Pete Rose right at WrestleMania 14, and Pete goes out in front of the fans in Boston and the heels on him, and then with the Red Sox, and then it was fantastic, but kind of turned Kane face for a few minutes, and Kane brings up that before all this, the big match with Taker, he was a super nervous to it, but he drills Pete with a power bomb, and Austin, brings up that Kane went from heel to face and then back to heel again all in the same night. Kane says that Pete would have made a great heel manager. They quickly go through the next two Manias, and Pete autographed a bat for Kane and gave it to him just as a gesture. So that was they definitely had some good times on there, and it was a good way to kind of just end the show a little bit with a little bit of a laugh. And the Pete Rose, it was always funny. Pete Rose just kind of came out in a chicken suit one time, and he just always chased Kane around, and Kane just always beat him up. So I always found that to be very entertaining. Well, some of the closing thoughts that we get then, that they end on a good fun note. Austin asks Kane how much longer he wants to wrestle. He brings up how he won the 24/7 title, and he had his dream match of him and Taker against DX, and he would be down for doing that again. He likes popping in there, and he just doesn't want to say he's completely done. He does enjoy coming in from time to time. Well, then Austin wraps things up and thanks Kane for coming out for the interview, and he puts him over and for having a career that most don't. And, he wishes him and the fine folks of Tennessee the best, and as he's taken his new role of Mayor Kane. So, and that is the end of the Stone Cold Steve Austin podcast. So, some final thoughts on this one. It was a good show. It was good to see Kane talk a little bit about, how he came about the business. Most like of these Broken Skull sessions do. We got some good stories. For the most part, we did plug the book in the beginning, right? And then we did get the other side of the previous Undertaker episode, but on Kane's side of that version. So that was just good to hear it from both ends. I like these sessions and I enjoy them. So that's my overall final thoughts. I think it was a good one. Nothing really too shocking in this story, but maybe worth a watch if you want to put it on in the background, that kind of thing. But guys, those are my final thoughts. So let's get to your final thoughts. And we're going to get out of here for today. But this has been Steve Austin, the Broken Skull Session. So as always, I want to say thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe. It helps out my channel. And let's burn the house down with Kane.